Lana Harper had not expected that the quiet streets of Ashwood, a modest suburban town in Virginia, would become the backdrop of a new chapter in her life. She had spent years in New York working as an architect, designing glass towers and minimalist office spaces for clients who never cared about the details as much as she did. The city had drained her. The relentless rhythm, the noise, and the weight of a divorce that had left her emotionally and financially bruised pushed her to look for a place where she could breathe again. When she first saw the old Victorian cottage with the sprawling garden behind wrought iron gates, she felt something stir inside her, a longing that she had nearly forgotten existed. The property was weathered, the shutters chipped, the pathways uneven, but the garden, despite being overgrown and untamed, was magnificent in its bones. There were ancient oaks whose branches stretched like open arms, a crumbling stone fountain covered in moss, and a gazebo that leaned precariously to one side but still hinted at its former elegance. To most buyers it looked like a liability, a money pit that would devour their savings. But to Lana, it was an unfinished project that demanded her hands, her vision, her patience. Moving into the house had been both exhilarating and terrifying. She arrived with little more than her drafting tools, a few boxes of clothes, and a stack of old sketchbooks. She turned one of the dusty upstairs rooms into a studio, covering its walls with pinned sketches of garden layouts, light studies of how the sun fell across the trees, and renderings of how she wanted to restore the gazebo with a lattice roof and climbing wisteria. Unlike her corporate work in Manhattan, this was not about deadlines or clients. This was hers alone, her chance to build something permanent in a world that had taken too much from her. Every morning she walked the garden with a notebook, writing down small observations, where the soil was richer, where the shade lasted longest, how the wind funneled between the hedges. She found herself talking aloud sometimes, describing to no one in particular what she would change, how she would transform the chaos into harmony. Her neighbors were mostly polite, the sort of suburban residents who waved when they collected their mail or exchanged brief pleasantries at the grocery store. They were not nosy, at least not overtly, which suited Lana well. She had not moved here to build a social life but to retreat from the constant need to perform. The one exception, however, quickly made herself known. Karen Mitchell, who lived 2 houses down, introduced herself during Lana's first week. She was in her late 50s, immaculately kept, with a posture that suggested years of correcting others. Karen had been a military wife, widowed for several years, and had an air of someone who believed her tenure in the neighborhood granted her authority beyond what any homeowners association document could confer. She arrived at Lana's door carrying a basket of muffins, which might have seemed generous if her eyes had not roamed immediately past Lana into the hall, as though cataloging details to store away. Karen complimented the garden repeatedly, though always in a tone that implied ownership, not admiration. "This property has always been the heart of the neighborhood," she said more than once. "We've had gatherings here before, long before you moved in. It really is the perfect spot for a celebration." Lana laughed politely, assuming it was small talk, the kind of nostalgic chatter that older neighbors often shared about local traditions. She thanked Karen for the muffins, endured the conversation, and thought little more of it. Yet, over the following weeks, Karen returned again and again with various pretenses, bringing cuttings of roses she claimed would look better in this soil, asking if she could walk her dog through the garden because he loves open spaces, or pausing by the gate simply to comment on how quickly Lana's renovations were progressing. Each visit left Lana with an uneasy feeling that she could not quite name, as though her sanctuary was already being quietly tested. The turning point, subtle though it was, came one evening when Karen leaned against the garden fence during one of their brief encounters. She mentioned that her daughter was recently engaged and sighed theatrically about how difficult it was to find the right wedding venue. "Such a headache with these hotels and country clubs," she said, her eyes drifting over the fountain and the gazebo as if measuring them. "But then again, sometimes the perfect place is right in front of you." Lana smiled stiffly, sensing a suggestion buried in the remark, but gave no answer. The truth was, the garden was not ready even for her own quiet enjoyment, let alone a wedding. The thought of strangers trampling the grass she had just seeded and leaning against the fragile gazebo made her stomach tighten. She told herself it was just a neighbor's fanciful comment and pushed it from her mind, not realizing that it was not a suggestion, but a declaration of intent. As the weeks passed, Lana poured herself deeper into her restoration, determined to shape the garden before winter settled in. Yet, in the back of her mind, Karen's words lingered, irritating as a splinter. Something told her that this neighbor was not simply talkative. She was planning, calculating, waiting for the moment to assert herself. And though Lana had no evidence of what was coming, a faint instinct told her that the garden she considered her sanctuary was about to become the center of a conflict she could not have imagined when she signed the deed. The first real sign that Karen's intentions went beyond neighborly enthusiasm came one late Friday afternoon in early spring, when Lana returned from a supply run in town with her car loaded with timber slats, ceramic tiles, and a stack of paint. Samples. She was tired from the day but looking forward to a quiet evening sketching out her next phase of renovations. As she pulled into the narrow driveway, she immediately noticed movement in the back garden. At first she assumed it was a deer, as wildlife often wandered in from the nearby woods, but the sound of clanking metal and male voices quickly disabused her of the thought. She parked hastily, her pulse quickening, and walked around the side of the house only to stop short in disbelief. There were at least half a dozen men in her garden, dressed in matching polo shirts with a local event company logo embroidered on the chest. They were unloading folding chairs from a truck parked just beyond the fence, setting them in neat rows that stretched across her newly reseeded lawn. Others were carrying boxes of string lights and long banquet tables, while one was hammering supports into the ground for what appeared to be the skeleton of a white wedding tent. At the center of it all, directing the workers with the confidence of a general on a battlefield, was Karen Mitchell, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched atop her head, and an air of supreme authority as though she owned not just the space but the day itself. For a few seconds Lana could only stare, her brain scrambling to reconcile the surreal scene with reality. When Karen finally noticed her, she raised one manicured hand in casual acknowledgement, as if Lana had merely arrived early to an event she was expected to host. "Lana, perfect timing," Karen called, her voice carrying over the metallic clatter of poles and the rustle of canvas. "We're getting the layout started. I told them to keep the tables away from the fountain so the view isn't obstructed. Don't worry, we'll make sure everything is cleaned up afterward." Lana's throat tightened with anger, but she forced herself to speak calmly, though her voice trembled with disbelief. "What on earth is going on here? This is my property. Who told you that you could bring these people here?" The workers paused, some glancing nervously between the two women, but Karen's expression did not falter. She walked toward Lana with measured steps, flipping through papers on her clipboard as though she were about to present evidence in a courtroom. "I understand this looks sudden," Karen said with a tone of exaggerated patience, "but arrangements were made with the previous owner long before you purchased this house. We had an understanding. This garden has hosted community events for years, and when my daughter set her wedding date, it was only natural we would continue that tradition." She produced a document from the stack and handed it to Lana, who accepted it reluctantly, her hands trembling as she scanned the text. It was formatted like a rental agreement, complete with dates and signatures. According to the paper, Karen had a 10-year lease agreement with the late Mr. Whitaker, the elderly man who had lived here before Lana bought the property, granting her rights to host private or community gatherings in the garden. The signature at the bottom resembled Whitaker's, at least to someone unfamiliar with his hand, but something about it looked wrong, too stiff, too carefully imitated. "This can't be real," Lana whispered, her heart pounding. "This house was sold to me free of any encumbrances." There was no lease. The deed is clear. Karen's smile widened, though her eyes glittered with something sharper. Of course, the deed doesn't mention it. This was a personal arrangement, but one that has always been honored. You wouldn't want to be the kind of person who breaks promises made by those who came before you, would you? Especially not when the whole neighborhood is expecting this celebration. The audacity of the statement left Lana momentarily speechless. She glanced again at the paper, noticing inconsistencies. The font of the dates didn't match the rest of the document, and the notary stamp was smudged in a way that seemed almost deliberate. She looked back at Karen, who stood poised with the certainty of someone who expected compliance. "This is forged," Lana said finally, her voice low but steady. "I don't know how you got this, but it has no authority. You can't just take over my garden because you feel entitled to it." Karen's demeanor shifted ever so slightly, the polite veneer cracking to reveal irritation. "Lana," she said, her tone dropping into something more condescending. "You're new here. You don't understand how things work. This house has always been part of the fabric of this neighborhood. We all have memories here. My husband, God rest his soul, organized barbecues on this very lawn." Mr. Whitaker was happy to share it, and he assured me before he passed that nothing would change. You wouldn't want to insult his memory, would you? The manipulation was so blatant it nearly made Lana laugh, though her stomach was churning with dread. The workers had resumed their tasks as though her objections were nothing but background noise. The white frame of the tent was rising against the sky, and the rows of chairs stretched farther across the grass with every passing minute. "Stop this right now," Lana said sharply, raising her voice for the first time. "I am the owner of this property. I did not give permission for any of this. Pack it up and leave." Karen pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing. "I don't think you want to escalate this. You'll find that the community doesn't take kindly to selfishness. Everyone has already been invited, the caterers are booked, the musicians scheduled. If you make a scene, it will reflect very poorly on you. Think carefully before you embarrass yourself." The threat hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Lana felt a wave of helpless rage crash over her. She considered calling the police, but something told her Karen had anticipated that move and would simply wave her document at them, claiming legitimacy. Even if it was fake, even if it would never hold up in court, it was enough to create confusion in the moment, enough to stall any decisive action. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the chaotic garden, Lana realized that she had just been drawn into a battle she had never asked for. Karen was not simply presumptuous, she was calculating, manipulative, and utterly convinced of her own authority. And while Lana still clutched the forged document in her hand, she understood with chilling clarity that this was not a misunderstanding to be resolved with a polite conversation. It was a challenge, a declaration of war over the very ground she had thought would be her sanctuary. That night, long after the workers had left equipment stacked in the corners of the garden under Karen's assurance that setup would resume tomorrow, Lana sat at her desk staring at the papers spread before her. Her deed, her survey maps, and the suspicious lease agreement that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. She traced the forged signature again and again, the sick realization dawning that her neighbor had planned this for months, perhaps even years, waiting for the moment when she could claim ownership of a place that was never hers. And as much as Lana wanted to believe that logic and law would protect her, she sensed in her bones that Karen would not stop. Not now, not ever, until she was forced to. The following week became a blur of unease, each day marked by new intrusions that chipped away at Lana's sense of ownership. The morning after the first confrontation, she discovered fresh tire tracks cut deep into the gravel drive, evidence of heavy trucks moving in and out while she slept. A stack of rental crates labeled glassware, fragile, sat beneath her gazebo as though her garden had been converted into a storage facility. When she marched down to the street to demand answers, she saw Karen chatting cheerfully with two men in suits by the corner mailbox, pointing at the house as if she were presenting it as part of her estate. Lana approached, her pulse drumming in her ears, but before she could open her mouth, Karen turned with that infuriatingly calm smile and introduced her to the strangers as the new caretaker of the property. Lana corrected her with a sharp, "Owner," but the men looked unconvinced, as though Karen's words carried greater authority than Lana's truth. That evening, when Lana was hauling the unwanted crates out of her garden and stacking them by the curb, she was startled by George Holloway, the elderly veteran who lived across the street, leaning on his cane at the edge of her lawn. He was a tall, gaunt man, always polite when they had exchanged greetings, but now his expression was unreadable. "You should know," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "Old Whitaker did let the neighborhood use this place for barbecues, church picnics, 4th of July. Karen isn't lying about that." He paused, eyes narrowing. "But whether that means she can just take over now, that's another question." Lana wanted to scream that community barbecues were a far cry from commandeering a private property for a wedding of 200 guests, yet George's words gnawed at her, planting the doubt Karen relied on. As the days passed, the preparations escalated. Delivery vans pulled up without notice, leaving behind boxes of floral arrangements, catering supplies, even a sound system that two young men lugged into her garden while nodding politely as if they belonged there. Lana confronted them, demanding they leave the equipment outside her gate, but one of them waved a paper in her face, insisting they were contracted to deliver to this address. The paper bore Karen's name, but the address was indeed hers, and before she could argue further, they had left the speakers leaning against her fountain. At night, when she tried to sleep, the glow of floodlights pierced her curtains, illuminating her bedroom as workers continued setting up long past dusk. It felt as though her garden had been transformed into a public square and she into a squatter within her own walls. She called the police one evening when the noise became unbearable, but the officer who arrived seemed reluctant to get involved. He examined the dubious lease agreement Karen produced and, while admitting privately to Lana that it looks fishy, told her this was a civil matter to be resolved in court. Karen watched smugly from her porch, arms crossed, as though she had anticipated exactly this outcome. Lana knew she needed professional help. She scheduled a consultation with a local attorney named Meredith Clark, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for untangling property disputes. Meredith flipped through the forged agreement, her brow furrowing as she scrutinized the notary stamp and the mismatched fonts. "This is sloppy work," she muttered, "but sloppy doesn't mean harmless. People like your neighbor rely on intimidation and appearances. If she can convince enough people she has the right, then, practically speaking, she gets away with it until someone proves otherwise." Lana explained about the police visit, the deliveries, the constant harassment. Meredith nodded grimly. "She's escalating because she thinks you won't fight back. We'll file an injunction, but until it's granted, you're going to keep living like this." The weight of Meredith's words pressed on Lana during the restless nights that followed. Every time she heard footsteps outside, she jumped to the window, only to see workers staking more ground, neighbors drifting by to watch, or Karen herself, strolling with the air of a queen inspecting her domain. It was not simply about a wedding anymore. It was about dominance, a power struggle over whose claim to the space would be recognized by the community. The worst blow came when Lana received an envelope in her mailbox, not from Karen but from the Homeowners Association, which she had barely interacted with since moving in. The letter claimed that her property had historically been an agreed community venue, and urged her to show flexibility and neighborly spirit regarding its use. Though the association did not assert legal rights, the tone was unmistakably aligned with Karen's narrative, suggesting that resisting the arrangement would damage her relationship with the neighborhood. Lina felt her stomach drop as she read the letter, realizing that Karen had not only manufactured documents but was shaping public opinion against her, portraying her as the unreasonable outsider against a tradition everyone else supposedly valued. That night, she sat alone at her kitchen table, the letter from the association on one side, the forged lease on the other, and her legitimate deed spread between them like a thin shield. She remembered the first day she walked into this house, the joy she felt at the prospect of building something that belonged solely to her, a sanctuary untouched by anyone else's demands. Now that dream seemed fragile, infiltrated by a woman who wielded falsehoods with the confidence of truth. The garden she had envisioned as a place of peace had become a battlefield, and the first skirmishes had already been lost. Yet, as much as fear twisted inside her, anger grew sharper. For the first time since the ordeal began, Lana's hands stopped trembling as she gathered the papers into a folder. If Karen wanted a fight, then she would have one, not in whispers and forged agreements, but in the full light of the law. The midpoint revealed itself not as a single revelation, but as a chain of small, stubborn facts that resisted Karen's narrative the way stones resist a flood, and it began when Meredith insisted they stop arguing in Lana's kitchen and instead walk. The long corridors of the county complex, where the fluorescent lights hummed and records were kept by people who did not care about neighborhood traditions or the social gravity of a widow with a clipboard. They requested every filing tied to the property, from the most recent deed to the oldest subdivision map. And when the clerk brought out a microfilmed reel for the notary registry, Meredith leaned in with the same intent focus Lana used when measuring run of light across her garden, tracing the commission number stamped on Karen's lease to a notary whose commission had expired 2 years before the lease's stated date, which meant that even if the signature had been genuine, the seal was time-traveled fiction. The clerk, a woman who had probably seen every flavor of family dispute and fraudulent lien the county could produce, printed a certified notice of expiration on security paper with a watermark like a ghost, and Meredith tucked it into a growing folder that now included a copy of the title insurer's Schedule B, where no lease, license, easement, or permissive use was listed, because, as the underwriter confirmed in a terse email followed by a phone call, we would have excluded or priced for that risk if it existed. A sentence that sounded dry until you understood that an insurer is the last institution to let sentiment cloud a hazard, and if they said it wasn't there, it wasn't. By the time they left the building, the folder had acquired enough weight to feel like a physical rebuke to Karen's confidence. Yet Lana knew paper alone would not stop trucks from arriving, and as they crossed the parking lot, Meredith said in a voice that kept excitement in check, "We file for an emergency order today. We'll need a bond, and we will serve every vendor who steps onto your grass." They did not go straight home, because on the way, fate or logistics or the ordinary messiness of deliveries intervened. A driver misread a label and dropped a heavy box at Lana's gate addressed to Ashwood Garden House, a name she had never heard but which, when she slit the tape in her hallway and lifted the flaps, turned out to be a bundle of glossy brochures printed on thick stock, each page filled with photographs of her fountain and her leaning gazebo, retouched to look upright with copy promising intimate ceremonies in a historic garden. Bookings available through a number that matched Karen's, deposit due at signing, rain plan unspecified. The brochure did not mention Lana, not even as an owner, only the property, as if the garden were a public square awaiting whoever announced their intention loudly enough. And when Lana drove to the print shop named on the invoice, the manager, flustered but honest, confirmed that the order came from Karen with proofs approved a month ago, and there were already follow-up print runs slated because interest was high, a phrase that revealed motive more clearly than any confrontation could, since once money began accruing in the mind or the pocket, it demanded protection. Meredith listened without interruption, then asked for the purchase order and payment method details, which the manager provided in the form of a statement that put dates next to authorizations and quantities next to promises. And by the time they returned to the car, Lana understood that the wedding was not a favor to a daughter but a keystone in a small business built on borrowed ground, which explained the certainty in Karen's voice and the way she spoke as if she were defending a public utility rather than a private scheme. Filing for relief felt like pushing a boulder uphill with both hands, while someone on the other side salted the slope. Yet within hours, Meredith drafted a petition that braided the expired notary commission, the title insurer's confirmation, the misleading brochures, and the accumulation of trespasses into a single argument that asked the court to freeze the chaos before it congealed into precedent. And she warned Lana that an emergency order is a narrow bridge. You cross it by showing irreparable harm, likelihood of success, and the inadequacy of money to fix a place trampled before it has been made whole. The judge on duty did not give them comfort or warmth, but did read everything, asked 3 precise questions about possession and notice, set a modest bond that Lana posted out of the savings she had been reserving for timber and stone, and signed an order that, for the first time since this began, said in formal language that no one was to enter, deliver, assemble, test, or rehearse on the property without Lana's written consent until a full hearing the following week. Meredith's paralegal moved like a metronome, arranging service on the event company, the rental supplier, the florist, the sound contractor, and the homeowners association, and copies were taped to the gate and mailed by certified post because in disputes like these, redundancy is a virtue. That evening, the garden was finally quiet, the strings of lights drooping like abandoned vines, and the silence felt almost hostile after so many nights of clamor. Yet within it, Lana could hear the pulse of her own resolve, the way you hear the house settling after a storm. And she walked the path from the kitchen door to the fountain reading the order again, the watermark catching dusk, the language strengthening her spine. Karen did not vanish with the order, nor did she rage in a way that would have given Lana satisfaction. She appeared the next morning at the property line with a tape measure hung from her belt and a survey plat photocopied to low contrast, announcing to anyone who happened to pass that the usable strip along the hedgerow was not truly Lana's, but part of an easement Whitaker had once granted in spirit, a phrase as slippery as it was meaningless, and she told the florist who had come to retrieve his crates that the ceremony might shift to the margin, as if relocating a vow to a boundary could erase a command from the court. The survey pins, which Lana had learned to identify as dull metal caps buried under the soil, were suddenly the subject of neighborhood debate, with men stooping in their weekend clothes to poke at the earth and offer opinions that had the confidence of maps and the substance of rumor. And when Meredith heard about it, she arranged for a licensed surveyor to restake the corners and mark a bright chalk line that made the shape of the lot undeniable to anyone equipped with eyes. That afternoon, as Lana watched the man set his tripod and take bearings in the heat, George Holloway stood beneath the oak with his cane balanced like a third leg, and in a voice low enough to keep it between them, said that even in the years when Whitaker hosted barbecues he did so by invitation, and when he grew tired he would close the gate and everyone understood the difference between hospitality and entitlement, a distinction that required no paperwork even if they now had a clerk's certification to lean on. Lana did not ask him to testify, not then, because it felt like conscripting a neighbor into a war that was already fraying the edges of civility, but he added that he had told Karen as much, and she had answered with a smile that did not reach her. Eyes which told Lana that the next move would not be a retreat but a reconfiguration. When the server finally met Karen outside the church hall where she was finalizing seating charts and handed her the folded order, Karen opened it as if it were a menu, scanned quickly, and said something to her companions that Lana could not hear. From the sidewalk, a soft, soundless response that contained neither shock nor submission, and that night a new kind of pressure emerged. Not deliveries or lights, but emails and notes from neighbors who had believed the story of a harmless tradition. and now felt personally implicated by the scale of what had been promised to them, asking if there was any way to compromise for just a few hours, or to allow a simple ceremony with no reception. And Lana, who had been starved of reasonable conversation for weeks, recognized the trap inside the civility, because conceding even a narrow slice of the day would acquiesce to the central lie that the garden was shared by default. She wrote back with measured words, citing the order and the evidence, refusing to be drawn into a poll of local opinion, and when she set her laptop aside, the garden outside her window looked both smaller and more defended. A space defined not only by fences and pins, but by sentences on paper and a willingness to enforce them. The midpoint stood before her not as victory, but as a ridgeline from which both valleys were visible, the path where she held ground at cost, and the path where she allowed herself to be made a steward of someone else's enterprise. And she understood, at last, that Karen's true talent was not in fabrication, but in making hesitance look like consent, and that the only antidote was a decision that admitted no performance, no compromise, and no ceremony on soil that was hers. The week following the emergency order was supposed to give Lana some space to breathe, yet the silence of the garden was deceptive, like the stillness before a storm that gathers out of sight. The order had been served, the vendors warned off, and the neighbors reluctantly stepped back from their questions. But Karen was not a woman who retreated because a judge had written a few lines on embossed paper. She began working through channels that Lana had not anticipated, turning her battle from open trespass into a campaign of pressure and attrition. And it started with the Homeowners Association, whose letter had arrived one morning in Lana's mailbox, with the same smug weight as Karen's forged lease. The letter accused her of maintaining unauthorized structures and unapproved event facilities on her property, citing the fountain and gazebo as potential code violations, and warned that fines could be assessed if inspections revealed non-compliance. Lana read the letter twice, aware that the gazebo predated her by decades and that the fountain was crumbling too badly to attract envy. But she also knew what it meant. Karen had convinced the board that her property was not a private sanctuary, but a communal asset that needed to be reined in. Meredith advised her not to panic, reminding her that associations thrived on intimidation. But Lana could not shake the feeling that she was being pushed into a maze where every path led to another trap. Soon after, neighbors who had once waved politely began to avoid her eyes, some even crossing the street rather than acknowledge her presence. A rumor had spread that Lana was planning to sue the association for damages, bankrupting the community in her selfish pursuit, and though she knew exactly whose tongue had launched that rumor, its effect was corrosive nonetheless. The groceries she once collected with ease became awkward errands punctuated by whispers at the end of aisles, and one afternoon she returned home to find a bag of rotting fruit hurled against her gate, its sticky pulp sliding down the iron bars in a slow, accusatory smear. The harassment shifted shape daily. Anonymous flyers appeared on windshields in the neighborhood, warning that Lana's lawsuits would drive up dues for everyone. One evening, she discovered her garbage cans tipped and their contents scattered across the sidewalk like a staged display. Another morning, she opened her mailbox to find it stuffed with photocopied clippings from local newspapers about nuisance neighbors and frivolous litigants, each one circled in red ink with comments like, "Sound familiar?" written in a hand she did. Not need to study long to recognize. The strategy was transparent. Make her appear unreasonable, isolate her, and soften her resistance until she gave up. Yet the most alarming escalation came when the vendors began to return, not openly as before, but at odd hours with deliveries left just outside her property. A refrigerated truck idled for half an hour in front of her gate one dawn, and when Lana approached the driver to demand what he was doing, he simply handed her a clipboard and muttered that he was instructed to wait for the event coordinator. When she asked who that was, he shrugged and said, "The lady who booked me, Karen." The driver seemed genuinely confused when Lana insisted there was no event. and that he was trespassing. "Look," he said, pointing at his invoice, "I got a deposit, I got an address, I got a date. If I don't deliver, I eat the penalty." "You want me to lose my job?" He left only when she threatened to call the police, but his words lodged in her mind. Karen was still paying deposits, still feeding the machine, still binding innocent people into her scheme so that Lana looked like the one sabotaging livelihoods. The pressure finally breached the walls of her house when a group of guests dressed formally and carrying wrapped gifts arrived at her gate on a Saturday evening. They had traveled from out of town, they explained politely, following invitations that bore her address, and they were bewildered to find a locked gate and no event in sight. Their disappointment was genuine, their anger misplaced, and as Lana tried to explain that they had been misled, she realized Karen had crossed into outright fraud, using her home as a lure for strangers who now associated Lana with humiliation. That night, Meredith advised her to begin documenting everything. Not just the forged lease, but the invoices, the flyers, the fruit against the gate, the guests left stranded on her lawn. "She is building a campaign, not just an event," Meredith said grimly, "and campaigns are fought with patience and evidence." But patience did not dull the fear that crept into Lana's routines. She began to hear noises in the garden at night, footsteps that crunched too heavily for raccoons, voices that cut off when she switched on the lights. Once she found cigarette butts stubbed out near the fountain, left behind by people who had no right to be there, and she wondered if Karen had sent scouts to check whether she had relented. Installing cameras became inevitable, though Lana hated the thought of turning her sanctuary into a monitored fortress. She mounted them discreetly along the eaves and the garden fence, the red lights blinking like vigilant eyes in the dark, and for the first time since moving in she felt her solitude curdle into paranoia. The footage confirmed her instincts. On 3 separate nights, the cameras captured Karen slipping through the hedge line, sometimes alone, sometimes with her daughter, inspecting the space as if rehearsing, even once measuring the distance between the gazebo and the fountain with a length of twine. Lana watched the clips in numb disbelief, her hands cold around the mouse. It was not only trespass, it was rehearsal for a reality Karen had convinced herself already existed, a rehearsal she carried out brazenly because she believed no one would dare hold her accountable. When Meredith saw the footage, she no longer spoke in the cautious tones of an attorney hedging bets. "This isn't just entitlement anymore," she said firmly. "This is a campaign of harassment, of stalking, of fraud. We will escalate too, and this time it will be her turn to answer questions." Lana nodded, her jaw set, feeling both exhausted and steadied. The second escalation had made one thing undeniable. Karen was not fighting for a single event. She was fighting for control, and only decisive confrontation would end the siege. The morning of the wedding arrived not with celebration, but with a sense of siege. Lana awoke to the muffled thrum of car engines lining her street, doors slamming, voices carrying with laughter that had no business near her home. She parted her curtains and saw clusters of guests in bright dresses and suits milling about the cul-de-sac, carrying gift bags and bottles of champagne as if they had been promised a fairy tale unfolding behind her gates. Some looked confused by the padlock, others irritated, and more than one pressed a phone to their ear while pointing toward the garden beyond the fence, demanding explanations that never came. When Lana stepped onto her porch, she was met not with sympathy but with glares, as though she were the obstacle in their carefully planned celebration. And there, in the center of it all, was Karen, dressed in a pale lavender gown that matched the flowers clutched in her hands, her face serene as though the order, the injunction, the warnings, none of it had ever existed. Karen greeted guests like a queen whose castle lay just beyond reach, assuring them that everything was under control, that the caretaker was simply being difficult, and that soon the gates would open. She never looked at Lana, but the pointed avoidance was more cutting than any direct challenge. Lana felt the old fear pressing against her ribs, yet this time she carried not just indignation, but the weight of proof. She had the videos, the invoices, the brochures, the expired notary stamp, all stacked neatly in the hands of Meredith, who had arrived just before dawn with a grim determination that left no room for doubt. "Today is the day we stop playing defense," Meredith had said. "If she forces this, then we meet her in front of a judge while the paint is still wet." The confrontation came swiftly. A rental company van pulled up, attempting to unload food warmers and champagne flutes, and when Lana stepped forward with a copy of the injunction in her hand, Karen finally turned her head, her expression a mask of disdain. "You're embarrassing yourself, Lana," she said loudly enough for the guests to hear. "Everyone knows this garden belongs to the neighborhood. You're only here because Mr. Whitaker trusted us to keep it alive." Her voice carried over the murmurs, weaving the lie with the practiced ease of someone who had repeated it until it felt like truth. Lana held her ground. "This is my property, and you are trespassing. There will be no wedding here today." She handed the document to the delivery driver, whose eyes widened as he skimmed the seal and signature before quietly packing his crates back into the van. Karen's face twitched, the first crack in her facade, but she quickly turned to the guests with a flourish. "Don't worry," she said. "We'll sort this out." Bureaucracy always finds a way to ruin joy. Yet the conviction in her voice wavered, and whispers began to spread among the crowd, questions she could not silence with charm. The decisive moment arrived not from the guests, but from the sudden arrival of two uniformed deputies accompanied by a court officer carrying a folder thick with filings. Meredith had acted faster than Karen anticipated, securing a contempt motion when the videos of her trespasses had been presented earlier that morning. The officer approached Lana, verified her identity, and then turned toward Karen with the solemn efficiency of someone who had delivered such papers before. He read aloud the court's finding, that Karen Mitchell had willfully violated an injunction, that her continued occupation of the property constituted contempt, and that immediate service of additional charges was now required. The murmurs among the guests turned to gasps, and several pulled out their phones, but no one intervened as the officer handed Karen the documents she had tried so hard to pretend did not exist. Karen's composure faltered at last. She sputtered protests about family tradition, about community promises, about Whitaker's supposed blessing, but each word sounded thinner than the last, falling flat against the hard silence of the deputies who stood ready should she resist. Her daughter, pale and humiliated, whispered urgently in her ear, tugging at her arm as if begging her to accept defeat, yet Karen shook her off with a violent jerk, insisting that none of this was legal, that it was all a conspiracy. But the illusion had collapsed. Guests began drifting back toward their cars, the champagne unopened, the flowers wilting in the heat, unwilling to stand in the blast radius of her unraveling. Lena, though trembling, did not gloat. She simply watched as Karen was escorted from the gate, clutching the thick bundle of papers that spelled out her downfall. The victory was not sweet, not yet. It was raw, heavy, edged with the knowledge that her garden had been trampled not by feet, but by lies. Yet, as the last car pulled away and silence fell once more over the street, she felt a shift inside her chest, a release of the pressure that had coiled for weeks. She had not just defended her property. She had forced truth to stand where deception had strutted. That evening, when she walked the paths of her garden, she noticed the damage, the crushed grass, the discarded ribbons, the faint scent of perfume clinging to the air. But she also saw the space as hers again, marked not by Karen's delusion, but by the resilience that had carried her through. The climax was not a burst of triumph, but a hard-earned restoration, and for the first time since moving into the house, Lana felt certain that her sanctuary could endure. In the weeks that followed, the echoes of the failed wedding lingered in the neighborhood like smoke after a fire, drifting into conversations at the grocery store, whispered exchanges across fences, and the awkward silences that fell whenever Lana passed by. Karen's humiliation had become a story retold with slight variations by every household in Ashwood, But no variation changed the truth. She had been stopped, publicly and decisively, and the garden she tried to claim had slipped from her grasp, forever. The Homeowners Association, wary of further exposure, withdrew its threats and quietly suspended all mention of community access in its newsletters, and several board members who had once nodded along to Karen's schemes began avoiding her entirely. Even George Holloway, who had once defended the idea of neighborhood traditions, visited Lana one afternoon with a slow, careful apology, admitting that what he called memories had been twisted into weapons against her. His words were halting, but sincere, and for the first time Lana felt that the wall between her and her neighbors had begun to crumble. Her garden bore scars from the ordeal, patches of grass flattened by tires and shoes, stray bits of ribbon caught in the hedges, but each day she worked with deliberate patience to restore it. She reseeded the lawn, repaired the fountain's cracked basin, and began sketching new plans for the gazebo, imagining not strangers seated under its roof, but herself, with books, with sketches, with moments of solitude that no one could take from her. She hosted no large gatherings, only quiet evenings with a few friends, where the clink of glasses and the murmur of voices felt like a reclaiming of space rather than a surrender of it. And though she could still feel the ghost of Karen's presence whenever she walked the paths, like an echo of defiance that refused to die, she also felt something stronger rising in its place, a certainty that her home was hers, not because a deed said so, but because she had fought for it and refused to yield. The last time Lana saw Karen, it was at the far end of the street, where the older woman moved briskly toward her car, avoiding eye contact, her once imperious posture diminished by the weight of her defeat. There was no confrontation, no final words, only a silence that carried more than any argument could. Lana watched her go, then turned back toward her house, the iron gate closing with a firm click behind her, the garden stretching out in front of her with all its imperfections and promise. It no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a beginning,